happens to be a gentleman, Ralph, and that seems to be something that you have forgotten all about. He treats us like women. That's something you've forgotten too, Ralph. You seem to have forgotten that I am a woman.
How could I? You're always yapping.
What if a single unscripted moment ended one of television's most legendary comedies overnight? The Honeymooners redefined sitcoms with its raw, working-class humor. But behind the laughter was a moment so unsettling, it was buried for decades.
This was the woman he should have married years ago. And it was just a short sketch, so I don't remember too much about it. But it was serious. Here we were doing it on a comedy show with very little rehearsal.
One line, delivered differently than ever before, silenced the audience and sent shockwaves through the network. This is the story they tried to hide. A collision of political blacklists, sponsor panic, and a live broadcast that crossed an invisible line. Was it a mistake? Or the night Jackie Gleason revealed more than Ralph Cramden could handle? From Brooklyn streets to TV glory. Jackie Gleason's story didn't start under bright studio lights or in the comfort of a Hollywood mansion. It began in a cramped Brooklyn apartment, the kind where every creak of the floorboards carried the weight of struggle. Born in 1916, Gleason was raised in an Irish-American neighborhood that was as tough as the sidewalks he walked every day. His father abandoned the family when Jackie was just 9 years old, leaving his mother to hold things together with low-paying jobs and long hours. That kind of loss shapes you. For Gleason, it created a deep well of frustration, ambition, and grit that would later pour directly into the character of Ralph Cramden. Gleason didn't have the luxury of a clear path into show business. He spent much of his youth hustling, pool halls, odd jobs, and whatever it took to bring in a little money. The neighborhood itself was a theater of raw personalities. Loud arguments spilling out of tenement windows, neighbors who lived paycheck to paycheck, and people whose dreams were always a little bigger than their means. These were the voices, the mannerisms, and the emotional rhythms he would eventually channel on live television. When Gleason yelled as Ralph Cramden, it wasn't just acting. It was Brooklyn coming back to life in front of the cameras. A variety stage was the board for his real big break, and not a sitcom. Gleason, with his natural charm and timing, held an almost magical appeal for audiences. By the early 1950s, he had his own television show on the Dumont network called Cavalcade of Stars. In 1951, Ralph Cramden was introduced to the world. The character was not meant to be the refined version we envision today, but instead portrayed as crude, loud, impatient, and always plotting. Television audiences used to seeing the cardigans and sage wisdom of the TV fathers all of a sudden found themselves watching a man shouting across a tiny apartment to an equally sharp-tongued wife. That was electric. While most television at the time romanticized suburban life, the Honeymooners sketches on Cavalcade spoke with a voice that embraced the grit. Ralph was a bus driver in New York City who never seemed to catch a break. He did not own a house in the suburbs, did not have a tidy lawn, and did not have a picture-perfect family. Instead, he counted endless schemes about getting rich quickly that ended up collapsing into comic disaster. And audiences loved it. They identified with Ralph in small victories and big failures. The other element that adds to the verisimilitude is Ralph and Alice Cramden's relationship. Alice was not the docile, smiling wife seen in all other shows. She gave as good as she got. She debated Ralph, pushed back against his bluster, and chastised him when his dreams got a tad too lofty. This wasn't some sitcom fantasy. It was an argument and make-up routine that very likely resembled kitchen argumentations across America. It wasn't easy casting Alice, though. Audrey Meadows almost lost the part completely. But CBS executives thought she was too glamorous and didn't imagine her being able to act like a working-class or middle-class housewife. Meadows, however, made it her ambition to prove them wrong, put on fresh, no-makeup, unstarry clothes, hair pulled back. She would appear precisely like Alice to make the present case, and Gleason instantly would see her as perfect for the role. Alice was not always played by Meadows, as many would probably know. Pert Kelton, originally, was the first woman to put herself in being, yet she tends to adopt a sharper, more combative style. Then, she was replaced out of the blue with some official claims about health issues. The actual reason was murkier, and loads more political. During the high tide of the Red Scare, allegations about her husband's communist ties made her a risk the network would not take. So she went without fanfare, without public announcement. Gleason's rise wasn't just about laughs. Political forces would soon alter the Honeymooners in ways no script could predict. The casting shakeup no one saw coming. When the Honeymooners began to catch on, it was thanks in no small part to the chemistry between Ralph and Alice Craden. In the early sketches on Cavalcade of Stars, that chemistry was defined by Pert Kelton, the original Alice. Kelton wasn't just a straight man to Gleason's over-the-top Ralph. She had a sharp tongue, a quick wit, and a way of looking Ralph up and down that could cut him to size without a single word. She brought a rawness to the role that matched the rough edges of the early episodes. To the public, Kelton's sudden disappearance was a shock. The official statement cited health reasons, a polite and vague explanation that was almost standard in the 1950s when networks wanted to avoid scandal. But those who worked on the show knew the real story. The Red Scare, the nationwide hunt for alleged communist sympathizers, was at its peak. Entertainment was one of the industries hit hardest by the so-called blacklist. Studios, networks, and advertisers didn't just avoid hiring suspected communists. They distanced themselves from anyone even loosely connected to the accused. He was being investigated for possible ties to communist elements. In that atmosphere of fear and suspicion that hovered over both Hollywood and New York television, it had become untouchable. She was never formally charged. There was no evidence or proof of wrongdoing. But in an age when any whiff of association could sink a career in hours, CBS quietly pushed her out, calculating it way more convenient to do so without fanfare. She was tough to replace. Alice was never, ever a minor character. She was the one person who could stand up to Ralph Craden. Too soft, and the whole thing loses its zing. Too hard, and it sits all wrong with an audience looking for laughs, not domestic strife. The actress had to kind of create the character of the long-suffering spouse without making her too much of a pushover. Audrey Meadows was not the obvious choice, however. CBS executives dismissed her as too glamorous for the part during her audition. Meadows was well aware of what they meant, though. She would prove them wrong. She would show up for the audition in a brand new set of headshots that were the opposite of Hollywood sparkle. Plain dress, hair unstyled, no makeup. In those photographs, Meadows didn't look like a movie star. She looked like a working-class wife in Brooklyn who spent her days stretching every dollar. Jackie Gleason saw the photos and knew instantly she was the right fit. The minute Meadows got under the skin of the character, the chemistry altered in a big way. Alice Kelton had been loud and brash, always quick to match Ralph's energy and volume. Alice Meadows, however, was more grounded. Her sharp wit was still there, but with a calm, measured tone which made Ralph's bluster seem even bigger, rather than yelling back. Instead, she let Ralph's anger burn itself out before subjecting him to the line that would leave him badly shaken. It gave the show a different rhythm, one that balanced the intensity of Gleason with an underlying strength of quiet. Some longtime followers of the early sketches missed Kelton's fire. But Meadows' interpretation warmed Alice so that it widened her audience. Now, the audience saw not two always vying partners, but a couple that cared for one another, despite the disagreements. The onset of hostility was punctuated by periods of sentimental tokens. "Baby, you're the greatest," hit differently when it came after Meadows' Alice had spent an episode putting up with Ralph's wildest schemes. The political purge had reshaped the cast. But the real revolution was yet to come, when the show itself changed television history, breaking the mold of American sitcoms. When The Honeymooners spun off into its own series in 1955, television was a very different place. The airwaves were filled with pristine living rooms, neatly dressed parents, and smiling children who learned a moral lesson by the end of each episode. Shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver presented an idealized America: clean lawns, tidy homes, and fathers who always had the perfect advice. That was what television was supposed to be: reassuring, orderly, and, above all, safe. Jackie Gleason had no interest in playing it safe. When The Honeymooners debuted as a standalone series, it threw out almost every unwritten rule of the sitcom playbook. Gone were the polished suburban houses. In their place was a cramped Brooklyn apartment with peeling wallpaper and a kitchen table that served as the family's hub for arguments, hopes, and disappointments. Instead of children delivering cute one-liners, there was just Ralph and Alice, a married couple locked in a constant push and pull between dreams and reality. The genius of the show wasn't limited to its setting, but rather lay in its honesty. Ralph Cramden was no wise, steady patriarch. He was a working-class bus driver with an overactive imagination, short temper, and ability to unwittingly thwart his own plans. Alice was no passive and demure homemaker. She was wittily sharp-tongued and would stick to her guns. The characters were flawed, and that was exactly what made them connect with audience members. They didn't look like the shiny images on TV commercials. They looked like the people watching from their living rooms. Yet the format was what distinguished The Honeymooners. Each episode stood alone, a full-blown story with its own emotional arc. There was no need to follow an ongoing plot. The viewer could tune in on any given week and immediately grasp the lay of the land. It was here, however, that a brilliant layer of complexity lay. Ralph's exclamations, "To the moon, Alice," and "Baby, you're the greatest," became instantaneous cultural catchphrases, finding their way into workplaces, dining rooms, and even the odd political speech. The unique rhythm of the show was Gleason's stage history. He treated every episode like a one-act play, live and unrehearsed. Tight dialogue, fast pacing, and the immediacy of stakes, even the smallest domestic quarrels, felt real. There was no laugh track sweetening the punchlines. The studio audience laughed simply because the comedy was genuinely sharp and the tension felt real. That kind of authenticity was dangerous back in the 1950s, but it worked. In deviating from television idealism, The Honeymooners ushered in a different form of storytelling. Perhaps there wouldn't have been shows like All in the Family, Roseanne, or The Simpsons without this seminal work. Ralph Cramden provided the rough drafts for the rants of Archie Bunker, the kitchen table battles of the Connors, and the flawed but lovable exploits of Homer Simpson. It opened the door to a willingness to have a character be both unlikable and very human. There were also uncomfortable parallels for audiences. Ralph and Alice yelled at each other loudly, and often demonstrating that beneath the sarcasm and the yelling, there was warmth. "Baby, you're the greatest," was more than a punchline. It reminded everyone that love was capable of surviving even the dumbest fights. That sort of honesty gave the series legs. The converse of truth was that breaking the mold was risky. If audiences had a real-life situation they suspected, they could suddenly begin to turn. While the format was winning fans, one live moment would soon turn that realism into a national controversy. The night the audience went silent. It happened on a night no one expected, a night that should have been just another episode in a dependable run of live television. The date was October 1956, and the episode was titled The Deciding Vote. On the surface, it was pure Honeymooners territory. Ralph Craden, convinced that his single vote could swing a local election, winds up tangled in misunderstandings, self-importance, and inevitable humiliation. The script was clever, the premise relatable, and the live audience was ready for laughs. For most of the episode, things went as planned. Gleason was in his element, larger than life, quick with improvisations, and feeding off the energy of the room. But then came a moment that would change everything. During a heated exchange between Ralph and Alice, Gleason delivered his trademark, "Bang, zoom, straight to the moon" line. It was a phrase the audience had heard countless times before, a comic threat that had become a running joke. Only this time, it didn't sound like a joke. Nothing's different from delivery. Gleason's tone, sharper, colder. His body language drew closer. The space with Audrey Meadows seemed shrunk. His voice dropped into a register devoid of its usual comedic exaggeration. The punchline sank with a thud. No chuckles, no applause. Silence. The silence weighed heavily in the studio air, with crew members backstage saying later that they froze in the midst of tasks. For the first time, Ralph Craden looked not like a lovable blowhard, but dangerous. Not too different from reading the same way on a sitcom shot on multiple takes, with laughter recorded. But it was all happening on live TV. Every twitch, every pause, every unplanned emphasis played back in real time to millions of living rooms. Growing up in a pretty much taboo condition about domestic violence on TV, and certainly with no hint of realism in that focus, that moment felt disturbingly raw. The critics who had earlier lauded the content of the show for its honesty have now termed this scene too real. Consequently, letters started coming in at CBS not for praise, but concern. Behind the scenes, there was already unrest in the network. The ratings, while good, were slipping a bit. Sponsors were complaining about the raspy tone of the show, and live broadcasts were becoming increasingly risky as an unpredictable Gleason became harder to control. The moon line had always been incendiary, stepping this edge either toward fun or threat. But this time, it decidedly tipped. Not that the audience outrightly withheld its laughter, but somewhere there was doubt lurking in their mind. Was this really funny? Reportedly, Audrey Meadows had already expressed her discomfort with Ralph's anger in a few instances in the past. She was not afraid of Gleason. Rather, she understood how easy it was for a moment to go awry for an audience expecting harmless fun. On this night, she was justified. The line moved from funny to somewhat eerie in split seconds. In television, perception is everything. Nothing happened on the outside in the public view, but on the inside, the fallout was rather quick. Seeing the winds of change blow and fearing possible backlash from advertisers, the CBS executives began urgent meetings in private. One particularly important sponsor threatened to withdraw its support of the show if the edgier moments were not toned down. That was enough to make it a clear decision. No press release, no scandal, just a whispered end to the original 39 episodes of The Honeymooners. Behind the scenes, tensions boiled, and soon the show's end would come faster than anyone expected. The abrupt end and private fallout. The end came without warning. No farewell episode, no announcement to prepare the millions of loyal viewers who tuned in each week. One week, The Honeymooners was there. The next week, it was gone. To the public, it was a mystery. To Jackie Gleason and those inside the studio, it was a decision born from pressure, nerves, and the unforgiving economics of television in the 1950s. For Gleason, the cancellation was more than a professional setback. Ralph Cramden wasn't just another character in his career, he was a piece of himself, pulled from the streets of Brooklyn, shaped by years of struggle and brought to life through the rhythms of live performance. To lose the show was to lose the one platform where he could fully inhabit that creation. Friends later said he took it personally, as if someone had told him his life's work wasn't good enough. Officially, CBS kept quiet. There was no public mention of the tense boardroom meetings, the complaints from advertisers, or the chilling effect of that too real moment in the deciding vote. But the writing had been on the wall even before that night. Ratings, while still respectable, had dipped slightly. Advertisers were wary of anything that hinted at controversy, and Gleason himself was wearing down under the strain of producing a live half-hour comedy every week. No retakes, no safety net, no time for rest. That was the essence of doing a live television program. Gleason put the cast through, consisting of at least 2 or 3 rehearsals a week, and kept pushing everyone toward perfection. But this was a grind and a ton of work. Every Friday night was live, and every Friday night meant 60 million people could either witness the cast's talent and brilliance or be there to see the stars apologize for their failures. As much as Gleason cherished the adrenaline rush of live TV, it also took its toll on him. He was famous for going out late at night, heavy drinking, and living a lifestyle that wasn't exactly the best for sustaining his body under such a grueling schedule. So far, Gleason had not been ready to take Ralph and Alice out to pasture. In a highly unusual move for the period, he secretly bought back the rights to The Honeymooners from CBS, an intelligent move that would put him in complete control of the characters and their destiny. Over the next 20 years, he dutifully resurrected Ralph, Alice, and Ed Norton in sketches on his variety shows, and while the chemistry was still there and the laughs came pouring in, something about the magic changed. The passionate urgency of the original 39 episodes could never truly be recaptured. For Audrey Meadows, the finish of The Honeymooners represented a turning point. She did not pursue a sitcom again. Her focus now turned to business, where she later became one of the first women to serve on the board of a major financial institution, Consolidated Savings and Loan. Meadows' quick wit and intelligence had immortalized Alice, but, more importantly, her determination showed her to be just as formidable off-screen. Art Carney, the bumbling yet lovable Ed Norton, fared well in the years post-show. He moved on to film, earning accolades and even winning an Academy Award in 1974 for his role in Harry and Tonto. While he did keep in touch with Gleason, their professional paths rarely crossed in a substantial way. Carney would always be identified with Norton, yet he was successful in not being trapped by the role. But Gleason wasn't finished. He would gamble on a second act for The Honeymooners in a completely new setting. The Miami comeback that missed the mark. For Jackie Gleason, the end of The Honeymooners had never felt final. Ralph Cramden still lived in his bones, and the chemistry of Ralph, Alice, and Ed Norton was too strong to abandon forever. By the mid-1960s, Gleason saw an opportunity to bring them back, but this time, on his own terms. The revival wouldn't be a carbon copy of the original 39 episodes. It would be part of the Jackie Gleason Show, a variety program filmed not in New York, but in sunny Miami, Florida. The move to Miami wasn't just about a change of scenery. It was a calculated decision driven by both creative freedom and financial incentives. Florida was offering tax breaks to productions, and CBS sweetened the deal by giving Gleason full creative control. No more battles with executives over tone. No more sponsor ultimatums. In theory, Gleason had everything he needed to recreate the magic of the Honeymooners without interference. But the Miami version was a different animal. For one, the format shifted dramatically. The original Honeymooners episodes were tight half-hour installments, compact stories with fast pacing, no filler, and the raw energy of live performance. In Miami, Gleason stretched the format into hour-long episodes, sometimes even longer. The pacing slowed, scenes lingered. What had once been quick, high-stakes domestic comedy now felt looser, more casual. There were visual changes, too. The gritty, monochrome Brooklyn apartment was replaced by cleaner, brighter sets. The charm of seeing Ralph and Alice navigate life in a small, worn-down space was gone. Everything looked more polished. The walls, the costumes, even the lighting. It was as if the working-class reality that had made the show relatable had been traded for a more conventional, television-friendly gloss. The original cast was reassembled. Gleason played Ralph, Meadows played Alice, and Art Carney played Norton, but the chemistry had changed. The years had passed, and by the 1960s, Gleason was older, heavier, and had much slower feet. The explosive bursts that had been Ralph's fury were becoming rather rare. He seemed to have opted for a more calm, measured delivery. Norton was the same lovable goof to Carney, but their banter with Gleason had lost snap. Still, Meadows' grounding force could not quite reignite the spark. There were moments of brilliance in certain Miami episodes, a timing-perfect exchange, a clever wink at the past glory days. More often, though, the mirth felt thin. The longer running time itself seemed to dilute the blow of the punchlines. The rapid-fire setups became increasingly saggy with extended dialogue that simply didn't work anymore. Part of the problem was watching live television, losing that dash of excitement, at least for that area. The original gang Honeymooners, live for a paying audience, had the impossible only happen before that audience, and through flubs and improvisations, that magic. But the Miami version was taped for the benefit of retakes and editing, thereby rendering it into some kind of control, giving away spontaneity. There simply wasn't the jitter in which audiences used to lean forward into their seats in anticipation. Rendered more cosmetic than the original Honeymooners, it really was very different from the source. In the end, Gleason, ever the perfectionist, tried introducing new stories, experimenting with music, and even invited guest stars. But it turned out all those changes simply proved the distance the show had traveled from its original incarnation. They ran longer on extravaganza, but shorter on heart in the reunion episodes as compared to the HB show. Without the focus on being tight around Ralph, Alice, and Norton's middle-class struggles, Miami simply had trouble hitting the same response. Even as the revival faded, the Honeymooners was finding a second life. Not on stage, but in the hearts of a new generation. From controversy to cultural icon. By the time the Miami revival faded, it might have seemed that the Honeymooners was destined to remain a fond but distant memory. The original run had lasted just 39 episodes. The Miami version couldn't capture the old spark, and newer sitcoms were dominating prime time. Yet what happened next was something even Jackie Gleason himself couldn't have fully predicted. The Honeymooners began its slow, steady climb from a short-lived show to a cultural monument. The transformation started quietly, in reruns. Local stations picked up the original episodes, filling daytime and late-night slots with the Cramden's black-and-white banter. Without the pressure of weekly ratings, the show was free to be rediscovered on its own terms. Viewers who had missed it during its first run now found themselves laughing along, and younger audiences, too young to remember the 1950s, were meeting Ralph, Alice, and Norton for the first time. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, reruns had turned those 39 episodes into something far bigger than they'd been during their original broadcast. The very qualities that once made the show risky, the working-class setting, the sharp marital arguments, the flawed characters, now felt fresh compared to the increasingly polished sitcoms of the era. What had been controversial in 1955 was, by then, part of television's charm. The infamous bang, zoom line, once at the center of the show's most uncomfortable moment, became a piece of Americana, quoted, parodied, and referenced everywhere from cartoons to political speeches. Context had shifted. By the 1970s, the line was seen less as a threat and more as an emblem of old-school TV humor, a relic from a time when sitcoms were performed like stage plays. Critics have examined the vocal series as it progressed through television. They called to attention how it served as something of a pathfinder that, going forward, would inform and distinguish character comedy. Ambition and frustration that knew neither bounds for Ralph Cramden, that mix of toughness and compassion that defined Alice, or that wacky loyalty cabin for all else that might have characterized a Norton. All these would be and have been echoed down the years in future television characterizations. All in the Family, Roseanne, and The Simpsons had no spiritual affiliations. They were genetics of the genetic descendants of the Honeymooners. In fact, even animated couples like Fred and Wilma Flintstone had Cramden blood in them. What makes it enduring and great are the realities. They didn't live in that fairy tale suburb. They had a tiny apartment. They didn't find wonderful little problems, tidy knots of problems. They met with real-door problems, such as a lack of money, faces of dreams coming to a halt, and the thick line of wanting more and having to make do. Realism that was shocking in the 50s became a quality hallmark of sitcoms in the subsequent decades. The Honeymooners were not just a show that became a touchstone. Lines from the series became part of American slang. Episodes were studied by aspirants for comedians and actors, while drilling timing, delivery, and character work into their heads. The cheap and simple production of a couple of characters and one main set stood out as proof that a great television show did not necessarily require an elaborate plot or expensive locations to sustain its greatness. What it did need was honest writing, sincerity in acting, and emotional truthfulness. In 1985, on the 30th anniversary of the show, special retrospectives, interviews with surviving cast members, and celebrations continued. By then, the Honeymooners had gained solid acceptance as one of the most important sitcoms in television history. The very controversy that once threatened to sink it deep down into the waters became nothing but a trivial footnote. Odd chapter in the story of a series whose influence escalated as the years went by. The infamous scene that pulled the Honeymooners off the air wasn't just a mistake. It was a turning point for American television. If you enjoyed uncovering the truth behind this iconic show, like, share, and subscribe, and click the next video for more stories Hollywood tried to keep in the vault.